Let me start off by recognizing that a major factor in the rising tensions that we're currently observing between the United States and China has been the resurgent role of the state in the Chinese economy. Since 2013, the trend away from private sector and toward state management is clear. The policy climate has discernibly shifted toward more state control. Indeed, China's economic growth in the first decade after its 2001 accession to the WTO was largely driven by the private sector. Nevertheless, the state and the Communist Party even remained major players in the private sector during this era. But today, more than 15 years after China's accession to the WTO, it has become clear that China's state-owned enterprises are not going to disappear. Thus, ensuring a competitive environment for American firms and workers requires imaginative and new approaches in thinking by U.S. leadership, especially about the issues of SOEs. In this testimony, I want to provide a framework to help set priorities for future U.S. policymakers. I will illustrate why current U.S. domestic policy tools have proven insufficient and why a U.S.-only approach is also bound to fail. I propose a two-pronged multilateral approach to attack the heart of the underlying problem regarding China's SOEs. America's domestic policy tools have not worked. So let's, as a case study, consider the example of steel. American application of anti-dumping and countervailing duties, the most oft-used trade policies in the United States, have long been effective at actually shutting Chinese steel out of the U.S. market. Even by 2009, more than 80% of U.S. steel imports from China were covered by anti-dumping. By 2017, this had increased to 95%. Yet stopping U.S. imports from China directly has not solved the underlying problems of distortions created by China's SOEs. Even with the U.S. trade restrictions in place, China continues to export to third country markets. China has expanded from less than a third of global capacity in 2005 to nearly 50% of the world's capacity in steel production today. As its economic growth has slowed recently, China has increased the share of its production that it exports, from only 4% in 2009 to nearly 14% by 2015. All else equal, China's exports lower world prices. They push steel producers out of third markets and into the U.S. market. This is simply the economic phenomenon of arbitrage. While U.S. anti-dumping and countervailing duties have not worked at addressing the distortions created by China's SOEs, the United States government has recently deployed 3 additional policies that involve putting additional resources toward trade remedy enforcement. But these will also not address the underlying distortion problems. The first involves the issue of transshipment. Transshipment is when the Chinese steel being exported to a different country, let's call it country X, is relabeled as made in country X and then shipped back to the United States, thus violating a U.S. anti-dumping order. This is clearly a criminal violation. But take the following example of this country X, which has its own steel industry. With less world capacity, it would simply produce for its own domestic market. But the introduction of low-priced Chinese steel into country X means that its own production is no longer needed for domestic production or domestic consumption. It can now be exported into the United States market that is now more attractive. The U.S. price of steel is higher because of these American trade restrictions in place on China. But by how I've constructed this example, there is no illegal transshipment activity. The same economic problem for America arises even though the transshipment problem is legally addressed. The second policy involves how the United States government has begun applying a particular market situation. This is legal terminology. This context to the construction of dumping margins in anti-dumping investigations. Take a recent case in which South Korea's production of oil country tubular goods, which is a downstream steel product, was found to benefit from access to Chinese subsidized hot-rolled steel as an input. The result was higher duties on the South Korean firm, keeping those imports out of the U.S. market. But again, if China's overcapacity drives down world prices of hot-rolled steel everywhere globally, downstream steel-consuming industries elsewhere benefit, even in countries that don't import the steel from China directly. Punishing South Korea, even though an OCTG producer in another country also benefits from low world prices without importing it from China, does not attack the SOE problem. The third policy initiative involves the recent U.S. global import restrictions. These include the application of steel and aluminum tariffs under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, as well as tariffs and other import restrictions on solar panels under Section 201 of the Trade Act of 1974. In these three cases, most U.S. imports from China had already long been covered by anti-dumping and countervailing duties. In each, the major countries facing the new global import restrictions in 2018 were military allies and economic allies, countries that also struggled to cope with the distortions introduced by China's economic system. Yet instead of being treated as allies, these countries have now been targeted by U.S. trade restrictions. This makes it more difficult to pursue the multilateral solutions that I propose next. So if these tools aren't going to work, what will? Well, here is my two-pronged approach. The first is to file a WTO dispute against China over the issues of its state-owned enterprises and the distortions that they are having on U.S. market access. It would be the most direct way of attacking the underlying concern. The dispute should include allegations of both Chinese violations under the WTO's agreement on safeguards and countervailing measures, but also non-violation claims that China's economic evolution has not allowed benefits expected under the agreement to materialize, even if China is not found to have technically broken any WTO commitments. Now, the United States should not do this by itself. It should file a broad-based WTO dispute jointly alongside America's economic allies, the countries with market-oriented systems that confront the same challenges posed by China. The European Union and Japan have indicated a willingness to engage, as evidenced by joint trade ministerial statements issued in Buenos Aires in December of 2017, in Brussels in March of 2018, and just last week in Paris. But other major players with systemic interests should also be engaged as well. The second and complementary prong of my proposed approach is to develop new and enforceable rules that both address any economic distortions arising from China's SOEs and that would be adopted via an international agreement to which China is actually a party. The political bargain for China would be an enforceable agreement on SOE rules, and in exchange, China would be allowed to keep its SOEs. So how to do so? I recommend beginning with the state-owned enterprise chapters of the recently negotiated Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement signed by the United States and 11 other countries in February 2016. The TPP's SOE provisions mandate non-discriminatory treatment, commercial considerations, non-commercial assistance, and competitive neutrality. There are also rules involving transparency and corporate governance that are fundamental issues since Chinese government and Communist Party officials often sit on the boards of companies and direct SOE decisions in ways that may be inconsistent with market signals. But importantly, this SOE agreement need not be negotiated under the context of a full Doha-like round or a single undertaking that would include the entire WTO membership. It would be better negotiated as a plurilateral agreement with a critical mass of countries, but including China. Examples of recent plurilateral deals include the first and second information technology agreements. Finally, new rules on SOEs not only need to be multilateral, but they also need to be enforceable and thus embedded into a trade agreement. Here there may be additional lessons learned from the regulatory experience of other economies, including the European Commission. Its member states have tasked the Commission with enforcing state aid rules between member countries that have differing levels of SOE involvement in their economies, to do so in a way that ensures a European level playing field. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I welcome the opportunity to take your questions.
Okay, Dr. Bown, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to address one small point related to your first question, which is why it's not, in my view, worth it for the United States to go at it alone in negotiating a free trade agreement with China. And the argument is it's a wasted opportunity. And it's basically because we would be doing all of the work. China would be providing benefits to the rest of the world that we should be getting the rest of the world on board for, right? So if and the good example of this is what China agreed to do a couple of weeks ago by lowering their automobile tariffs. That doesn't just benefit US-based producers, right? This benefits the Japanese and the Europeans, but we hadn't done this collectively with the Japanese and Europeans where we could have gotten something out of Japan and Europe for the fact that we did this. The same thing's going to happen if we get reform on state-owned enterprises. China's not going to be able to reform SOEs in a way that just benefits the United States. It's going to provide benefits for the world. So let's bring the world with us so that we can extract things from the world as well for doing this hard work. Get the Europeans to lower that automobile tariff that President Trump is interested in from 10% to whatever the lower level is. To my mind, if we do it by ourselves, it's going to be a wasted opportunity.
My question would be for Dr. Bown, if we were to be pushing for the type of multilateral approach you suggest, how would you get that second piece of your approach underway?
I envision this much the same way that Ambassador Hillman did for her big, bold dispute that would be on more intellectual property, forced tech transfer, and investment. Have a separate complementary big, bold dispute on state-owned enterprises. If we don't think the disciplines are there sufficiently within the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, again, there is this, as she indicated, this non-violation, nullification, and impairment clause of the Article 23, which basically says if China is doing things that are not allowing for normally expected benefits to materialize within the system, you can have a case there. And so I think you bring that first, you bring our allies on board, you do all of the work to kind of lay the groundwork. Hopefully you win that case, but again, it's going to take a couple of years to get down the line. In the meantime, you've started negotiations, and if China's not willing to come to the table on this plurilateral set of negotiations for state-owned enterprises, then you just begin it with the United States, Europe, like-minded countries, Japan, Canada, Australia. These countries have written down trade agreement texts and signed them that have state-owned enterprise chapters in them. I agree, they may not be enough. We may need to do more if we're thinking about designing this with respect to China, but you get those countries there first. Eventually, you're going to want China to be part of this thing because you're going to want it to be enforceable on China. But if you win these big, bold cases against China at the WTO, there you have leverage with respect to China. You have WTO authorizable retaliation from the system, not just the United States, but all these other partners as well, to hold China's feet to the fire and to say, your only way out of this politically is to negotiate a solution on rules that you're willing to adhere to and willing to live by and that will be enforceable under these new sets of agreements. And so just strategically, I think that's how the best way it is that I would see it play out.
Wu's article on China Inc., he says at the heart of the matter is the following question: what proves that a commercial entity is part of the state?
I want to basically address, I think, two points that your question raises. The first, I think, is, and while I agree with you, this is a really gray and murky area, and it's very, very difficult to think that we'll ever be able to draw a bright red line as to where control starts and stops. I think by highlighting it, what it does is it actually shows China itself, this is what the underlying area of friction is. And if you want to constantly be living in this world of suspicion and potential conflict, then keep going with the status quo. But this is where our current problems are with your corporate governance system. And if you want to help dispel some of that, these are the kind of things that you could do. And I think just explaining that more clearly to the Chinese system may have some benefits. But the second, I think it also raises the question for us as the outside is, it's not clear that we should always care. In small instances, it may be okay, right? So we have to prioritize for ourselves what are the economic consequences in which we should actually care about that and begin to think through that. So, and I lay some of this out in my written testimony as I would begin to think about this as an economist. We care when this leads to, perhaps concentration of the industry, which gives Chinese firms market power, which then can lead to more predatory actions. If it's going to be small firms that aren't engaged, then we shouldn't pay too much attention to it. Looking at when it has the potential to impose injury or adverse effects in WTO speak language, I think. So in any case, but it does raise the question. Shine the light on China and put it on them, show them why we care, but then also have us think for ourselves, if we can't always draw the red line, when economically should we care and pay more attention to it than others? I think let's step back for just a moment to think a little bit more broadly about what these state-owned enterprises, for example, in China actually do. And so yes, there's elements of them, they're big, there's some predatory, but what they also do is they're shock absorbers for China in the sense that, yeah, they're these big bloated firms, but they also prevent bankruptcies. They prevent layoffs, right? They absorb negative economic shocks that we don't allow firms and industries in the United States, for example, to actually absorb, right? Because we are a market-based economy. One way that we could address that in-house, I think, would be to build off of what Ms. Drake has already indicated, and this is, I guess, well, I'll take back what I said before. There are unilateral things that we could be doing in the United States to improve the environment, but they're purely on the domestic policy front. We should have better labor mobility adjustment policies, and I'm not just talking about throwing more money at TAA, We should have better labor mobility adjustment policies for all workers that lose their jobs, regardless of the source of that job loss, whether it's trade, technology, consumers just changing what they want, bad weather, bad managerial decisions. Workers need portability of health insurance, retirement, all of these things, right? We need to be doing better, retraining, infrastructure. So to that extent, I think there's some elements that we can take away and we can actually learn from the Chinese models when we think about what SOEs do that are actually a little bit positive in terms of the social coherence of China's society, where we have actually fallen short for our workers and I think our communities.